Okay, I think we should be getting started. I'm Stathis Kalivas, the co-director of the program in Hellenic Studies here at Yale University. I want to welcome you all for this annual Stavros Niarchos Foundation lecture, which honors the foundation by the same name, thanks to which we're able to organize a variety of activities in the context of this program. Just to remind those of you who are new to it, that we have two different sets of activities. We offer a number of courses, both in Greek language, Greek literature, and history. And also we organize a set of outreach activities, public lectures, conferences, of which this year we have a very rich set of activities. And I welcome you to be on our mailing list and be informed about all those activities. We have a very interesting program coming up. We're very grateful to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for this support, and it's always a good opportunity to remind those of you who may not know of him, of Stavros Niarchos, one of the most important economic personalities in Greece, big name in ship owning, a tremendous set of activities, and of course he left a very big part of his money for the creation of this foundation, which has really undertaken a very wide range of activities in the last few years. One of the most well-known and high-profile activities of the foundation in Athens has been the construction of the new National Library of Greece, along with the new Opera Hall on the coast of Athens, which is transforming the entire area. It should be ready in about a year and a half. But on top of it, they've been supporting a variety of activities in the field of research in universities in both Greece and the rest of the world. But also, after the big economic crisis hit Greece, they've undertaken a number of very important activities on the philanthropic side in Greece, both as a set of measures of relief there, but also a new initiative which is extremely ambitious and extremely welcome to help with the very important problem of youth unemployment there. We organize every year a major lecture which honors an important contribution in the field of either research that have to do with Greece or other artistic activities as well. We've had over the years the pleasure to welcome here some very important contributors to the study and understanding of various facets of Greece, especially modern Greece, which is what we focus. And so it's with great pleasure today that I would like to introduce Artemis Cooper, who is a well-known writer, has written extensively about various aspects of, I would say, European history and its ramifications. I had not realized how many of my friends, for example, were familiar with your book, Cairo in War, 1939-1945, which I haven't read, but after the enthusiastic reaction I got from my friends, I feel that I should. And today she's going to talk to us about the subject of her latest book, which is a biography of Patrick Leigh Fermor. Now, Patrick Leigh Fermor is an interesting person in two respects, at least. First, for who he was through his writings and who he was really, and I'm not going to say much about that because that's precisely the topic of the book, but he was one of those quintessential British characters of the mid-20th century, this combination of adventurers and travelers, extremely learned, but also very, very much interested in understanding, shall we say, the grassroots, so traveling around areas of Europe that were not very well known, participating in various activities during the Second World War on the resistance front, especially in Crete, kidnapping a German general, about which I'm sure that we're going to hear some, and of course writing a set of books about his travels that provide a very interesting angle from which to understand modern Greece and its evolution. But what is also very interesting, and what I hope to learn more about tonight along with you, is the fact that even though I thought he was probably an obscure person, only read by Greeks because he wrote so extensively about Greece and because he chose to live all his life in Greece, in Mani, where he built a beautiful house in Kardameli, I was surprised to learn of the extent to which he's developed a cult following, the extent to which people still read his books, retrace his travels, visit the places he's been, and are fascinating by his personality, which is also reflected in the fact that the book, his biography, has attracted so much attention. And so that is my big question tonight, and the issue on which I hope to learn more, how this particular person or the particular set of interests and life choices he represents have been able to be so enduring and to survive the test of time with so much success. So I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Artemis Cooper tonight to discuss with us your book, your biography of Patrick Leigh Fermor, and to learn more about this fascinating personality. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour to be here in New Haven to talk to you about Patrick Leigh Fermor in Greece. And I would love to thank the Niarchos Foundation and, of course, the Hellenic Studies programme for inviting me to give this lecture. And special thanks to George Sirimis and Stathis Kalivas, who have made my short stay in New Haven so interesting and enjoyable. Thank you. The other thing I'd like to say before we begin is that Patrick Leigh Fermor was a close friend of my family's for decades. So although it would sound much more professional to call him Leigh Fermor, I find myself always reverting to Paddy, which is the name by which I've known him since he was a child. Since I was a child. Biographers are supposed to be objective and dispassionate, and in my book I really did try to be so. But I can't change the fact that I found him one of the kindest and funniest and most interesting people I ever met. If anyone was blessed by the gods, it was Patrick Leigh Fermor. He was born with Byronic good looks, intelligence and talent. And one reviewer remarked that he had dodged and survived so many attempts on his life that he made Rasputin look like a quitter. He was admired as a writer and as a war hero. Women found him irresistible. Almost all his books won prizes. And if this isn't enough to make you boil with resentment, there's more. All his life, Paddy had the gift of making people feel happier and funnier and better read than they'd ever suspected. As one of his old friends put it, if only Paddy came in pill form so you could take one whenever you felt depressed. And he lived with such intensity that perhaps he didn't write as much as he should have done. But on the strength of what he did produce, Jan Morris and Bruce Chatwin have both hailed him as the greatest travel writer of his generation. And although he lived in Greece for over 40 years, he remained unmistakably British. His Greek, though fast and fluent, was marked by a pronounced English accent. And while all the food and wine at his table was Greek, he still clung to his tea and marmalade and whiskey and the Times. And yet, he felt happier, more relaxed, more fulfilled, and more alive in Greece than he ever did in his own country. In England, during one lovely English summer, he told a friend how much he was missing Greece. In spite of all this green Pacific beauty, he wrote, "This is not my world. It's like living in the heart of a lettuce. I pine for hot stones and thorns and olive trees and prickly pears." His years of travelling began quite suddenly in December 1933 when he was 18 years old. After a turbulent school career, he decided to leave England and cross the whole of Europe on foot, from the Hook of Holland to the city more commonly known as Istanbul, although he always called it by its Greek name, Constantinople. To set out on this epic walk, he said, was my first independent decision, and perhaps my first sensible one. He would live on his allowance of £4 a month, which in today's money I worked out was probably about $250. His father, who was the director of the Geological Survey of India, had said that this allowance would last until Paddy was 21. And since Paddy resolutely refused to show any interest in preparing for a career or a profession, heaven knows what the boy was going to live on after that. Paddy had no idea either. All he wanted to do was write. And decades later, he would describe the journey in two of his best-loved books, A Time of Gifts and Between the Woods and the Water. He reached Constantinople on New Year's Day, 1935. But the journey did not end there. In Bulgaria, he'd met some Byzantine scholars, and talking to them had awoken a burning desire to see Mount Athos, where the traditions of the great Byzantine Empire of the East still lived on. Paddy spent a month on the Holy Mountain, and with the help of the monks, the smattering of ancient Greek he'd learnt at school began to turn itself into Demotic. And after that, he went to stay with a friend who bred horses for the Greek army and joined his host at Strimonico to witness the last phase of the short-lived Venizelist rebellion of March 1935. Paddy asked if he might keep the horse a little longer, and so began his first travels in Greece. He rode eastwards and had not gone far when he came across a group of conical huts. He had seen such huts before and knew that they belonged to the Sarahcat Sahni, those aristocrats of the Greek nomadic world. He was very impressed and intrigued by their self-sufficiency and this extraordinary contrast between what seemed to be, on the one hand, a life of perfect freedom and the rigid customs that governed everything that they did. Paddy spent most of the next month on horseback exploring the wilds of Thrace and the Rhodope Mountains, and he was amazed by the generosity of the people he met. And without even knowing it, they gave him a gift that was as precious as it was unexpected. In the 1930s, the constraints of the British class system were much more stifling than they are today, and the contrast between England and Greece in this respect was a revelation. He became aware of a direct and immediate link between human beings, friendly and equal on either side, something which melts the barriers of hierarchy and background and money, and, except for a few exceptions, of politics and nationality as well. Allowance must be made for the fact that he was very young and a foreigner, and the Greek tradition of hospitality is very strong. But he wrote the passage that I've just quoted 30 years later, and by that time he knew Greece extremely well and had built a house there. But that sense of easy and unforced equality was one of the things that he most valued about being in Greece. He travelled south, by bus I should say, because by now he'd returned the horse, to Athens. And there, in the spring of 1935, he met the first great love of his life, a Romanian princess called Balasha Cantacuzene. She was 16 years older than him. And here she is, during their first summer together, working on a portrait of her young lover. He and Balasha spent the next 4 years together, mostly in London and Romania and Greece. And as soon as war broke out in September 1939, he hurried back to England to join up. This photo was taken in Venice, his first trip to Venice, as he was on his way back from Romania to England. By now, he could speak Romanian as well as French, German and Greek, and this ease with languages brought him to the attention of the intelligence corps. He trained as an intelligence officer and was sent to Greece in November 1940 as part of the Allied military mission to the Greek army. And attached to the Greek army, he spent several weeks in the mountains of Epirus and explored the borderlands between Greece and Albania. By March 1941, the Germans were massing on the Bulgarian border. And on the 6th of April, they started to pour through the Monastir Gap. And when Paddy returned to Athens towards the end of the month, the Allies were in full retreat. By slow degrees, on a number of increasingly unreliable boats carrying more and more people, Paddy eventually landed at Kastelli-Kissamo in Crete in early May 1941, and he was appointed liaison officer to the staff of Brigadier Chapel in the Heraklion sector. And from here he witnessed the German airborne invasion and the surreal sight of wave after wave of paratroopers landing in the olive groves around Heraklion. And despite furious resistance, by the 28th of May, the Germans were in command of the western part of the island. Now, of course, the Germans saw all this purely as an act, a very successful act, of war. And they were shocked when the Cretan civilians, instead of meekly cooperating with their new masters, attacked the invader with the same ferocity that they deployed on the Turks 300 years before. And yet, for all their bravery, and despite huge German losses, Crete fell to the enemy. In late May, the bulk of the Allied army, including Paddy, was evacuated by the Royal Navy, but many lost and wounded men never made it to the evacuation areas. It was the Cretans who fed and hid them for months at a time and formed networks to get them down to the south coast, from where eventually they would get away in small boats. Paddy spent the next year in Cairo and Haifa being trained in clandestine warfare, and he was inducted into the highly secret Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which was the British equivalent of the American OSS. And he was smuggled into the White Mountains in western Crete in June 1942 as one of the handful of SOE officers whose task it was to support the Cretan resistance networks. Now, of course, the information being gathered by the Cretans at this time was crucial, since the Germans were using Crete as a huge transit camp, refueling station and supply depot for their war in North Africa. Most of the intelligence was gathered at great personal risk by local people employed by the occupiers, and it was then passed on to runners who took it into the mountains, where secret wireless stations relayed it to Allied GHQ in Cairo. Paddy is always associated with the celebrated capture of General Crepe, but his first 15 months in western Crete were every bit as exciting and dangerous, and I don't think that the Crepe operation could have taken place without the experience and contacts that he'd made during that first spell of duty on the island. I'm just going to point out a few things. Of course, you know the geography, but the Germans are strongest in this western part of the island, with their capital here at Hania, and they control these central sectors too, with their headquarters at Arcanes and Retimnon. And this eastern part of the island is controlled by the Italians, with their base there at Neapolis. And here is a rare photograph of Paddy in disguise, with his hair and moustache dyed black. But although he could look the part, his Greek was very obviously that of a foreigner. And on the few occasions when he had to take a bus or walk through a crowded place, he was uncharacteristically silent, while his Cretan companions had to pretend that he was a simple-minded cousin. Paddy relished the excitement of clandestine life in the mountains, and like the Cretans, he was addicted to poetry and song. He learnt as many Cretan songs as he could, and his favourite was set to an old Turkish tune, and it was called Philedem. And in fact, he sang it so often that Philedem became one of his code names. Wireless activity could be detected by German reconnaissance planes, so the heavy sets and batteries and chargers were often moved at night, usually on human backs, over a terrain where every rock is sharp and jagged and every plant is bristling with thorns. In January 1943, when Paddy and a group of Cretans were shifting the equipment yet again, they were almost ambushed by several hundred Germans who'd fanned out across the hillside to look for them. And Paddy and two of his companions had to spend the whole of one freezing day in the thick branches of a cypress tree, while the Germans thrashed about, literally below their feet. And in May 1943, there occurred an accident that was to haunt Paddy for the rest of his life. He and his guide, Yannis Tsangarakis, in this photo, they're at the front there, with about a dozen Cretan andates, were resting on a ridge above the village of Anoia. Then their lookout appeared with the news that about 300 German soldiers had been spotted making their way up the valley. Now, this was no immediate cause for alarm. The Germans were always prowling around, But luckily, they never left the main paths. They couldn't find reliable guides. The guides would lead them out into the open and then leave them. So they usually stuck to the main paths where they could get back home again. So everybody reached for their rifles, which had been oiled that morning. And as he held the gun downwards, Paddy drew the bolt backwards and forwards, easing the springs. And as he did so, he accidentally pulled the trigger and found that the gun was loaded. The bullet ricocheted off a rock, and it hit Yanis Zangarakis through the thigh. He was sitting on the ground doing up his sariki, and it sort of passed through his body like that on the ricochet. And within an hour, Yanis Zangarakis was dead of internal injuries. Paddy, you can imagine, was shocked and appalled by what he'd done, and he wanted to go immediately to the Zangarakis village of Fotinou and tell what had happened to Yanis's family and beg their forgiveness. But all the Cretans present absolutely refused to allow it. They knew that Yanis's death had been a tragic accident, but in these difficult times, they said, evil tongues would say that Paddy had killed Yanis as a traitor or because he knew too much. And they made Paddy swear that he would not go back to Fotinou until after the occupation was over. And we'll pick up this story again a bit further on. And a few weeks after this event, in July 1943, Mussolini fell from power and was replaced by Marshal Badoglio. And the Italian troops occupying the eastern part of the island were delighted. They thought they were soon going to be home again. But their commanders, foreseeing an armistice, feared that they might be interned if they didn't surrender their weapons to the Germans, which was obviously the last thing they wanted to do. And it was at this point that General Angelo Carta, commanding the Siena division in Neapolis, secretly got in touch with SOE to explore the possibility of making his escape from the island. Paddy was keen to help, and with several Cretan guides, he escorted the general over the Lasiti Mountains to the south coast, where a naval launch was waiting just offshore. And Paddy, very polite as always, followed the general on board, and although he planned to return to the island within the hour, the wind suddenly got up and the sea became so rough that the captain refused to lower the tender again. So Paddy had no choice but to accompany the general all the way to Egypt. He made the most of his unexpected leave in the fleshpots of wartime Cairo. This sketch, by the way, is by Keith Douglas, who was one of the best of the soldier poets of the Second World War. But wherever Paddy was and whatever he was doing, he had a lot to think about. And having taken an Italian general off the island, he now conceived a plan for kidnapping a German general, and not just any German general, but the brutal General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, divisional commander of the Heraklion sector, who had been responsible for a series of savage reprisals in the Vianos area of Crete shortly before Paddy had left the island. And this plan was given the go-ahead by SOE Cairo, and Paddy put together his core team. This consisted of two seasoned resistance fighters, Manolis Patarakis and George Tirakis. But Paddy also needed someone who could pass for a German and who was a good driver. And his choice fell on a young officer called William Stanley Moss. And in February 1944, Paddy was parachuted into a little bowl in the mountains, southeast, sort of around there, southwest of Neapolis, in these mountains here. And it's a tiny little saucer of a thing, and it's February. And the rest of his team were due to follow right behind him out of the same plane. But the dropping zone was so small that they couldn't be dropped in the usual sort of stick formation. The pilot had to make a complete turn, 360-degree turn of the dropping area, and then drop the next man. So Paddy's dropped, shines his torch to say that he's landed okay, and in that moment a blizzard gets up and the pilot is forced to turn back. And they make various sorties again, trying to get the rest of the team in, and it was 7 weeks before the rest of the team could join him. And in that time, the hated Müller was promoted and moved to Chania. And it would be absolutely impossible to abduct him from there, where the Germans were strongest. And Paddy now feared that the whole mission would be aborted. But SOE in Cairo decided to go ahead anyway, on the principle that one general was as good as another. And the new target would be Müller's replacement in the Heraklion sector, and his name was General Heinrich Kreiper, and no one knew very much about him since he'd only just arrived from the Russian front. General Kreiper was seized on the night of the 26th of April 1944 on the road between his HQ at Niarchos, which is there, and his villa at Knossos, which is just south of Heraklion. He was bundled into the back of his official car, where Patirakis and Tirakis held a knife to his throat. And Paddy sat in front, wearing the general's hat, while Billimos took the wheel. And thus they drove right through Heraklion, past 22 German checkpoints. They abandoned the car just there on the north coast, opposite this little island. And then they meet up with that's where the car was abandoned, and then they meet up with the rest of the team and the general here at Anoia. And they take him over Mount Ida on the Siluriti Mountains and through the Amari Valley, somewhere around here, and then they finally get him off the coast somewhere around Rodakino. And before abandoning the car, Paddy and Tirakis could not resist breaking off its 2 official metal pennants, which had served them so well as they drove, hooting imperiously, through the Heraklion checkpoints. And they gave these as souvenirs to Billimos, who was an exceptionally good driver with nerves of steel, and they can now be seen in the Historical Museum at Retimnon. And in years to come, Paddy was often mortified and upset by tabloid retellings of the abduction of General Kreiper, which seldom mentioned their Cretan guides and lookouts, nor the villagers and shepherds who kept them hidden and fed at terrible risk to themselves. So although there isn't time to mention all the Cretans who were involved, I will tell you the names of those who appear here. Oopsie, wrong button. Hold on. That is Grigoris Narakis, Stratis Savaloiakis, Manolis Patarakis, Anonis Papaleonidas, George Tirakis, Nikos Koumis, and of course Billy and Paddy in front. But we're still left with the question, why did they do it? Kidnapping General Kreiper in May 1944 could not advance the liberation of Crete by a single second. Paddy's answer to that question was that in the early stages of the occupation, SOE had encouraged the Cretans to hold themselves ready for an Allied advance to liberate Europe through Greece and the Balkans. By 1944, however, it was clear that the advance was going to be through Italy, and the Cretans now felt sidelined, if not forgotten. And to steal a German general from under the very noses of the enemy would give a great boost to Cretan morale and make the Germans look exceedingly foolish. This slide shows George Tirakis and Dundernes and Manolis, whose job it was to guard the general and liaise with the local guides they relied on. Avoiding the Germans who had poured into the area to look for the general, the abductors marched for 18 nights across the island. Paddy calculated that at any time, probably over 200 Cretans would have known, roughly, where to look for the strategos and his captors. No one gave them away. The general was amazed to see the trust and cooperation between the British and the Cretans, who refused all payment for the food, shelter and protection that they gave the kidnappers. And then, 3 months later, the Germans occupying Crete launched a campaign of such brutality that it has never been forgotten. One has only to walk through the Amari Valley today and to see the memorials to the hundreds who fell during those terrible days of August 1944 to realise the scale of this atrocity, in which over 1,000 people were killed and 28 villages destroyed. Of those 28 villages, the Germans declared that 7 had been burnt because General Kreiper and his abductors had passed through that area. One of them was Anomeros, where this monument commemorates the victims. But there were other reasons for this destruction, which spread far beyond the Amari. Knowing that the war was almost over and almost lost, the Germans were planning to pull back to the west of the island, and they did not want any trouble from the Cretan Andates as they did so. and there had also been a significant number of desertions in German ranks. And by turning every one of their men into a looter and a killer, the Germans guaranteed that no future deserter could hope to be fed and sheltered by the local population as the Allied soldiers had been in 1941. This was the view of SOE's final report on its operations in Crete. But because the Kryper operation had been so dramatic, because it was the subject of a best-selling book by William Stanley Moss, which was subsequently made into a film with Dirk Bogarde there taking the part of Major Leigh Fermor, the abduction, I think, took more than its fair share of the blame for the reprisals of August 1944. The operation is still remembered with great pride in Crete and, of course, a certain ambivalence. Was it really worth it, asked one old man, to get one general off the island? Paddy was haunted by the reprisals and often found himself having to defend the operation, not so much on his own account as for his Cretan brothers-in-arms and all the people who had helped them so valiantly. At the end of the war, Paddy got a job as deputy director of the British Institute in Athens, where among his friends were the diplomat and poet George Seferis and George Katsimbelis, one of the great figures in modern Greek letters and an Olympic-class raconteur. "We saw each other almost every day," wrote Paddy fondly, "sometimes in Yanakis, more often, frequently in the old Apostos, or lower down under the wide eaves of the Platanos taverna. In fact, Paddy seems to have spent more time in the cafes and tavernas of Athens than he did in the British Institute. And when he was in his office, it sounded as if there was a Cretan party going on. And yet Paddy's Cretan friends had come to Athens in desperation, looking for work. Paddy gave them floor space in his room at the Hotel Grand Bretagne, and his office was their rendezvous, which didn't make him very popular with his colleagues. So it was suggested that he embark on a lecture tour to talk about British cultural subjects, such as Lord Byron or the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Paddy lectured in sparsely attended halls until he reached Corfu, where the British Council's work was in the hands of an enterprising woman called Maria Aspiotti. She told Paddy that people wanted to hear him talking about General Kryper, not English art and literature. And she hired an enormous cinema for the evening of his talk. And to Paddy's astonishment, it was packed with an enthusiastic audience. And from then on, he talked about the Kryper operation all over Greece. This photo was taken at some point during the time, and I hope you noticed he was very fond of sketching the little details around his map of Crete. So we've got a little galleon here, a little zephyr blowing the wind, and a sort of Loch Ness monster down here. But although the lecture tour was considered a great propaganda success for the British, the council had no wish to have Paddy back in Athens, and he was fired in December 1946, more or less the first and last job he ever had. Paddy was miserable, but in one way it was a blessing. He did not have to watch Greece tearing itself apart in the agony of the Civil War. And just before the end of the war, Paddy had met Joan Raynor, who later became his wife. She was a very remarkable woman, a seasoned traveller and a very good photographer. And in the late 1940s, she accompanied him on a journey round the islands of the Caribbean, which was the subject of his first book. But they both loved Greece, and in the early 1950s, they travelled together to the remotest and most inaccessible parts of the country. Paddy was to write 2 books on these journeys, but before he'd written either of them, he translated the wartime memoirs of his friend, George Sequindous. This is Paddy's wartime sketch of Sequindous, who was a poor shepherd from a mountain village in Crete called Azigonia. Boys like him were taught to read, and most of them could just about write their names. But George, with the help of the village priest, had taught himself how to read and write with fluency. He was 21 when war broke out, and he worked tirelessly for SOE all the way through the occupation. And although he was awarded a medal by the British in recognition of his courage, when the war was over, He was thrown into prison as a deserter because his military papers were not in order. Sequindous wrote his war memoirs to keep himself sane during the months he spent in prison. And Paddy was so impressed by the account that he translated the book himself and persuaded his publisher, John Murray, to publish it. Paddy's own 2 books on Greece, Mani and Roumeli, have never been out of print. And I would like to give you a little taste of his style and sort of the aspects of Greece that he celebrated. Is it romanticised? Yes, of course it is. I love it. This is a particularly vivid set piece, and it's constructed almost like a piece of music. Not all his writing is like this. It would be awful if it was. But I think it gives you an idea of the effects that he could achieve. It's from his book Mani, which was published in 1958. Paddy and Joan are on board a little sort of ferry boat, kaiki, which is full of people and chickens and goats. And they're somewhere between one island and another in the Laconian Gulf. Soon the delighted cry of Delphinia went up. A school of dolphins was gambolling half a mile out to sea. They seemed to have spotted us at the same moment, for in a second half a dozen were tearing their way towards us, all surfacing in the same parabola and plunging together as if they were in some invisible harness. And soon they were careering alongside and round the bows and under the bowsprit, glittering muscle blue on top, fading at the sides through gunmetal dune-like markings to pure white, streamlined and gleaming from the elegant beaks to the clean-cut flukes of their tails. They were beautiful abstractions of speed and energy and power and ecstasy, leaping out of the water and plunging and spiralling and vanishing like swift shadows, each soon to materialize again and sail into the air in another great loop, so fast that they seemed to draw the sea after them and shake it off in mid-air, to plunge forward again, tearing 2 great frothing bow waves with their beaks, diving down again, falling back and crisscrossing under the keel and deviating and returning. And sometimes they flung themselves out of the sea with this insane abandon in reverse of a suicide from a skyscraper, up until they hung poised in mid-air, shaking in a muscular convulsion from beak to tail, as though resolved to abandon their element forever. But gravity, as though hauling on an oblique fishing line, dragged them forward and down again into their rifled and bubbling green tunnels. The headlong speed through the water filled the air with a noise of rending and searing, and each leap into the air called forth a chorus of gasps, and each plunge a sigh. These creatures bring a blessing with them. No day in which they've played a part is like other days. I first saw them at dusk many years ago on the way to Mount Athos, and a whole troop appeared alongside the steamer, racing her and keeping us company for 3/4 of an hour. And slowly it grew darker, and as the night fell, the phosphorescent water turned them into fishes of pale fire. White-hot flames whirled from them, and when they leapt from the water, they shook off 1,000,000 fiery diamonds, and when they plunged, it was a fall of comets spinning down, fathom after fathom, league upon league of dark sky, it seemed, in whirling incandescent vortices, always to rise again, until at last, streaming down all together, as though the heavens were falling, and each trailing a ribbon of blazing and feathery wake, they became a far-away constellation on the sea floor. And then they suddenly turned and vanished, dying away along the abyss like ghosts. And again, 4 years ago, I was sailing in a yacht with some friends through the outer Cyclades, in the late afternoon of a long and dreamlike day. There was another visitation. A few bars of unlikely midsummer cloud lay across the west. All at once, the sun's rim appeared blood red under the lowest bar, hemming the clouds with gold wire and sending a Japanese flag of widening sunbeams alternating with expanding spokes of deeper sky into the air for miles and spreading rose petals and sulphur green across the silk lake. And then some distance off, a dolphin sailed into the air, and then another and yet another, until a small company were flying and diving and chasing each other and hovering in mid-air in static semicircles, gambolling and curvetting, or almost playing leapfrog, trying to stand on tiptoe, pirouetting and jumping over the setting sun, and all we could hear was an occasional splash, and so smooth was the water that one could see the spreading rings where they swooped below the surface. The sea became a meadow, and these antics like the last game of children on a lawn before going to bed. Leaning spellbound over the bulwarks and in the rigging, we watched them in silence, and all at once, on a sudden decision, they vanished, just as they vanished from the side of the Aphrodite in this chapter, off the stern, and shadowless rocks. Callaine la Delfinia, the captain said when they'd gone. They're good. Paddy always found writing a very, very slow and laborious process. But as he worked on Mani in the mid-50s, he became more and more anguished by the situation in Cyprus. The Cypriots, of course, were calling for enosis with Greece, while the British, determined to hold on to this base in the eastern Mediterranean, refused even to negotiate. During the war, Paddy had been willing to die for both Greece and England, and now he had to watch the two countries he loved best treating each other as enemies. He was in no doubt that the British policy in Cyprus was morally indefensible and strategically disastrous. And yet he was still enough of an Englishman to deplore the way that the Greek newspapers were comparing the British administration of Cyprus to the Nazi occupation. And in May 1955, Paddy visited Cyprus, where Lawrence Durrell had persuaded him to give a lecture for the British Council. And at this time, EOKA, the National Organisation of Cypriot Fighters, under the leadership of Colonel Grivas, were bombing and attacking British targets and service personnel. Paddy joined Durrell in Paphos to witness the trial of a group of EOKA rebels who had been captured while waiting for a kaiki loaded with guns and ammunition. And outside, a furious crowd were smashing windows and shouting for the release of the accused. And the Cyprus situation led to a dreadful quarrel between Paddy and George Katsimbelis. Like most Greeks, Katsimbelis believed that the EOKA rebels should be seen in exactly the same way as the resistance fighters in Crete, as heroes defending their homeland against an aggressive enemy, and in the long run, Paddy was forced to concede the point. He wrote a long article about Cyprus, 2 long articles in fact, for The Spectator in December 1955. There was only one solution, he said, which was to relinquish sovereignty over Cyprus and cede it to Greece before any more lives were lost. And describing the trial that he'd witnessed in Paphos, Paddy wrote, "It was depressing to see that those accused of running explosives into Cyprus for use against the British were exactly the same sort of hardy Greeks that had not only helped us to run guns and agents against the Germans, but had befriended and sheltered the straggling remnant of our defeated army at appalling risk to themselves." One of the most interesting chapters in Paddy's second book about Greece, Roumeli, and it was very much discussed this in Greece at the time, concerns what Paddy called the Helleno-Romaic dilemma, which he felt defined the experience of being Greek. The Hellene is urban, intellectual, progressive, someone who sees Greece as part of Europe. The Romios, on the other hand, is a countryman, conservative and traditional, who sees Greece as part of the Orthodox world. Hellene is the glory of ancient Greece, wrote Paddy. Romaic, the splendours and sorrows of Byzantium. And in spirit, Paddy, who certainly felt at least half Greek by now, was a Romios, and he was acutely aware that Romiosine, the Greek village way of life that he loved and wrote about, was in decline. Paddy imagines the Hellene asking him why the poor should be kept in ignorance and poverty and disease just to oblige a few romantic travellers. And of course Paddy could see the need for education and healthcare and economic opportunity as well as anyone. But in the early 1950s, he had also witnessed how the Greek authorities were conspiring to suppress many local customs, those which the Orthodox Church found heretical or indecent, and the government regarded as backward and primitive. Among them were the fire-walking rites of the Anastinari, who venerate Saints Constantine and Helena and walk over burning coals on their feast day, and the phallic celebrations of Clean Monday in Tyrnavos, which I will spare you. A glance at YouTube shows that Paddy needn't have worried. Both of these traditions, and of course many more, are alive and well, even of course now they're performed for the benefit of the tourists as much as for the locals. Paddy and Joan had always dreamed of settling in Greece, and in the early summer of 1962 they found the ideal spot, a headland surrounded by olive groves and cypresses, overlooking the sea just south of the village of Roumeli in the Mani. And here they built a house made of local stone, designed by the architect Nikos Hadjimikalis. This is the entrance, who had made a study of Greek vernacular architecture. But why, people asked, did he and Joan not settle in Crete? And certainly Paddy's Cretan friends felt rather hurt by the fact that he and Joan were putting down roots on the mainland. Well, one reason was that in Crete he could never really have lived as a private person. This rather bizarre monument, by the way, now stands at the road junction where the abduction took place. Wherever he might have settled on the island, his fame would have obliged him to become something of a public figure. Someone who was expected to take sides, write letters to the papers, defend his friends, and take a stand on everything from private disputes to local politics. But of course all Paddy wanted to do was write. And in the Mani he could live undisturbed. And the other reason he couldn't live in Crete brings us back to the sad tale of Yannis Zangarakis, the guide whom Paddy had accidentally killed in 1943. As he had always intended, Paddy did go back to Yannis's village of Fotinou after the war was over and met Yannis's brother, Kanakis. "Is it true you killed my brother?" Yes, it was a terrible accident. But Kanakis had turned on his heel. He didn't want to hear another word. And from then on, Paddy was the target of a vendetta. This meant that he had to be very careful when he came back to Crete. He often saw Kanakis or his son waiting on a hillside with a rifle and binoculars. But of course, as long as he was accompanied by somebody who was not in feud with the Zangarakis, he was safe. The vendetta was only lifted in 1972, thanks to the efforts of George Sequindous, and the reconciliation was sealed in the traditional way, with Paddy standing as godfather to the little great-niece of Yannis Zangarakis, whom he named Ioanna, after her great-uncle, and also after his own wife, Joan. One morning in April 1967, Greece woke up to find that a group of middle-ranking army officers had seized power in the night. Paddy and Joan never supported the colonels, and many of their friends found themselves arrested and imprisoned. But unlike the Cyprus question, which involved Britain directly and evoked a passionate response in Paddy, he never spoke or wrote against the junta in public. When asked why, he replied that whoever governed Greece was a matter for the Greeks alone. When his study was finally finished, this is it looking very clean and neat, Paddy settled down to write, though life always got in the way. Spring and autumn brought an endless procession of guests, and there were visits to Crete and Athens, and he and Joan would return to England for a few weeks every summer and winter. This, as I say, is what the study looked like when it was new. And this, here it is again in 2009, looking more as I remember it. He ordered books by the dozen, wrote letters in several languages to many of his friends, and he must have subscribed to at least a dozen literary magazines in French and English and Greek. And it was in this room that he kept his Cretan military medals, his citations from the Athens Academy, and his Grand Cross of the Order of the Phoenix, which is given to foreigners who've been particular friends of Greece. Many people have compared Paddy to Lord Byron, and one can't deny that they both enjoyed dressing up. Yet Paddy was always very uncomfortable when people hailed him as some sort of avatar of the poet. Byron, he felt, had given everything for Greece, his fortune, his health, and eventually his life. And the Greeks had taken him to their hearts, and Paddy felt that every subsequent Englishman, himself included, benefited from the association and basked in his glory. But Paddy too had been an inspiration. George Dundernes, who moved to the US after the war and became head here of the Crete Veterans Association, remembered meeting Paddy as a very young man. "You were a revelation to me," he wrote. "While everyone in our company pretended to be a brave palikari, you were radiating a genuine fearlessness, and I certainly tried to imitate your calmness and courage." Paddy's wife, Joan, died suddenly in 2003, leaving him desolate. But he lived on in the house they had built together until his own death in June 2011. And as he and Joan had wished, the house was left to the Benaki Museum in Athens. The idea was that it should become a writer's retreat or a place for seminars and conferences, but it will need substantial repairs and modernisation before that happens. And as Dominic Green, in his recent article for the Weekly Standard, which I do recommend if you're interested in this, he makes it very clear that little so far seems to have been done. Writers and editors on Leigh Fermor have been much quicker off the mark. Since his death, there has been a biography, and I'm sure it won't be the last, and the final posthumous volume of his Trans-European trilogy has been published, entitled The Broken Road. And we've seen no less than 3 books appearing that focus on Crete and the kidnapping of General Kryper. Paddy is now buried in an English country churchyard beside his wife Joan, but as you see, Greece is still with him. I'm sure you will recognise the words that come from Constantine Cavafy's poem on the epitaph of King Antiochus of the Commagene. I will not attempt it in Greek, but in English, that line and the 2 that follow it read thus: "He was that best of things, Hellenic. Mankind has no quality more precious. Everything beyond that belongs to the gods." Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, but while you're thinking of one, I'll turn back to a happier slide. Oops. Oh no, it's dead. No, wait a minute, I've turned it off. Maybe that's rather nice. Yes?
Who designed the just jackets of the Mani and the Roumeli?
They were done by a wonderful artist called John Craxton, who eventually settled in Ania in Crete. And he and Paddy, I mean, all of Paddy's books were, until sort of right up more or less to the end, were done by John Craxton. Yes?
What was the name of the resistance group that he was involved with in Crete?
Gosh, I don't know. I don't think it. Didn't know that it had a name. It was just sort of the friends and people he was with. I wasn't aware.
But I mean, when he was an officer, when he was a liaison.
Yeah. Oh, I see. When he was with the Greek military mission.
No.
Or when he was with SOE.
Was he involved with the resistance, with the Greek resistance?
Well, with the Cretan Resistance, but that was sort of a matter of people and the capitans and, you know, the different groups. But as far as I'm aware, please somebody call in and correct my ignorance, but I was not aware that there was a particular name. I mean, if it was, yeah, I don't know if I can help you on that.
Affiliation.
A political affiliation, none that, well, they weren't the communists, put it that way, if I can put it in a negative.
So they were nationalists?
They were probably nationalists,
They
yes.
were not part of an organization.
Oh.
Just working with the SOE.
They were just working with SOE, yes, I don't think they were.
They were not members of an independent organization.
Yeah, no, they weren't. Sorry, there was somebody, it was a gentleman there.
They were
yes.
just fighters. In other words, there was the head of the resistance movement who was the head of a family.
That's right, yes, a capitan.
This is how it was working.
Yeah. Yes, lady.
You said you were friends with him, your family was. Your friends, sometimes you don't always know everything. Was there something that really surprised you that you found out that, like, say, now that you find it out, looking back, it's like fills in a piece of the puzzle of maybe something of his life or his personality that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, I sort of, he was a very, very private person, so I realized I hardly knew anything about him at all, so almost everything was a revelation. But I don't know, I suppose it was sort of the extent, what surprised me, I suppose, most, was the extent to which his writings, particularly the books on that early journey across Europe, were very much novelized, as it were. I mean, when you're remembering over 30 years back, things are going to get novelized anyway. But there were certain moments when he very deliberately changes the story. And when I found out sort of by accident, and he said, "Oh, you won't tell, will you?" There you are, I have. And it's in the book. Yes, a gentleman.
The moment that you described the rapprochement, the end of the vendetta, when he became the godfather, was very striking to me. Did he write about that?
No, he never did. He told me about it, but he never wrote about it, as far as I know. But again, you see, well, heaven knows what's going to turn up, because the whole of his archive is now in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, in the John Murray Archive. And I think probably most people doing a biography within a certain limited time frame, you don't see every single piece of paper. You're taking core samples, really, throughout the continent of papers that there are. You take core samples where you're interested. So these papers, I think that they are beginning to catalogue them, but it's an enormous work. And so heaven knows, something might come up. But I think he would have shown it to me. I think he would have, I would be surprised, put it that way, if something did turn up on that subject. Yes, the lady.
I had two questions. One is, you talked about his feelings, his conflicted feelings with the Cyprus problem. What about his feelings, if he related them to you, or if you have found anything in his archives or correspondence about how he felt as the Germans were retreating and the British seemed to be rather slow in following them up, and then also with...
Sorry, the Germans retreating where?
From Greece.
From Greece. We see he comes off the island. He's very ill by the time he leaves. When he gets the general off, he's suffering from this extraordinary kind of paralysis. And so he's 3 months in hospital. And actually, I think all he's at that point really desperate to do is, the war has sort of gone to the Far East and he wants to go there. But he's not given a clean bill of health. So I think that's upsetting him far more in a way than what's going on in Greece.
The other part of that was in December of 1944, when Churchill said to Scobie, treat Greece as a conquered country, or I don't know the exact quote. And there were planes strafing Athens.
Absolutely.
And tanks in Athens.
Yeah.
Did he ever
he wasn't. He never did. I think he would be, he appalled by it, obviously, but he wasn't. I think. Well, hold on. No, he was. He was probably, because he was working with the December. When was it? December 44.
Right.
No, he wasn't there. He was in Cairo then. He was very briefly in Crete, and then he goes back to Cairo. So he misses all that bit.
But did he?
He never talked to me about it, but I think he would have thought it was appalling. But no, he never. We didn't discuss that bit. Yes.
I've been going to Crete for the last 30 years. I have traveled extensively. The destruction, I don't think that people understand about how much Crete suffered. There is no other place. There is no, especially in Aranoia, especially in Llanos and so forth, in Suya. There are just so many memorials.
I know.
I have to say something. We went to a village, I think it was right above Suya, which is in the southern part of Crete. And as we were going up the wheeling road, all of a sudden we come up to a memorial, and it's a woman holding a child overlooking the Libyan Sea. And the only thing you see there, it's like a little amphitheater, the only thing you see there is quotation from a Athos poem. It says, "Glory to the people that guard Thermopylae." So we go into the village, and we go to the little, of course, square there, and I asked an elderly, I said, "What is that memorial? And does it say the historic?" He says, and he explained how the Germans had gone out and had killed so many people, burned the village, and so forth. And then I said, "How come you don't have something? You know, such a date." But this is, we have it here, and we have it here. We don't have twice, you know. And to me, that was the Cretan spirit.
Yeah. Yes.
I just had a quick question about him as a writer. You were saying that it was slow for him often, and I was seeing a difference, I suppose, in some of the. You described that he would often write from a great distance away from the actual experience, that he was sort of novelizing in many ways. He's looking back over many years. But that's not true, maybe, of parts of the Broken Road, or there's a sort of dashing quality in some of his letters.
Well, the Broken Road is written, although it's the last part of the journey, it's written before A Time of Gift and Between the Woods and the Water. It comes first. That was written in the mid-60s. And A Time of Gifts comes out in 1977, and Between the Woods and the Water in 1986. So it's, it's very...
I have a related question. We know why the Greeks like Fermor. What is it that he brought to English writing in the second half of the 20th century that makes him so special for English writing?
Yeah, I think that
English public, you see.
Oh, they loved him at the time. He was always very, very well reviewed. I think they loved that, the mixture, I mean, the extraordinary sort of range of it, that you could have sort of set pieces like that dolphin piece, and then very, very funny stories, extraordinary historical digressions. He was kind of in the tradition of people like Norman Douglas and Robert Byron. And I think that was a style that people really appreciated. They loved all that learning. I mean, people say to me now, "Oh gosh, this is really dense, this is really heavy, this is sort of full of, historical allusions, and, I feel it's all going over my head." But, sort of 30, 40 years ago, people didn't think like that, and they enjoyed it. And so I think, but he carries on having this sort of cult status. Lots of people have never heard of him. And other people think he's God, and everybody else is sort of somewhere in the middle. But why do people have a cult following? I don't really know. But certainly, I was astonished at the interest. When he died, suddenly everybody wanted to hear about him, and lovely for me, catch the wave, as it were. But yes, he does. There was an enormous curiosity and an interest, and kind of goodwill too, wanting to know more. Yes.
Exactly, follow up on that, which is precisely on the one hand, he didn't write that much.
No.
He was certainly part of a larger group of people who wrote. Perhaps he was among the better known ones, but he was by no means a celebrity. And still, even though he was liked at the time, his writing is the writing that comes out of a very specific time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Continues to generate this kind of interest, and this endurance is very puzzling. And so I was wondering, perhaps, isn't that perhaps the effect of his personality? He had a lot of friends who admired him for who he was, as opposed to what kind of writer he was. And then those friends then perpetuated or created this image of him.
Yeah.
But what exactly? There has to be something that explains the fact that he's able to generate such a tremendous interest over time, unlike many other people such as him who wrote about.
Well, are you thinking of anybody in particular?
No, but I'm sure that if we were to look at this travel writing milieu, we would find people who were...
Yeah, but and who are also very well known and equally celebrated. You know, Wilfred Thesiger, just off the top of my head. There are lots of other sort of great adventurers who were writing astonishing books. Then Norman Lewis.
All
you
of
know.
them have this kind of status over time.
Yeah, I think so.
So then the question is, what explains the endurance of all those writers?
Well, we're obsessed by travel writers, I suppose. I mean, I think it's a genre that's very popular, and the fact that he was sort of war hero. I mean, let's face it, that whole kidnapping of the general is sort of the boy's own, you know, war story, really. And I've seen it in sort of cartoon form, and then there's the movie and all the rest of it. And it was sort of one of the great sort of daring-do bits. So I think there's that. And there's sort of rather a wonderful kind of glamour about it. Maybe that's what we're trying to get to. It's perhaps not just the books, not just the kidnaps, but something about him as a personality that people found very engaging and interesting. And maybe boils down to the fact that he lived a life that perhaps we would all rather like to have lived. Yes.
But on the subject of style, I know you edited a volume of the letters that we exchanged.
I didn't edit them, no. That was Charlotte Mosley.
Sorry.
In Terror and
There is
Haste.
Yes. But is there any plan to collect his correspondence?
There is, yes. Where he has 3 literary executors, of whom I'm one. And we are actually sort of right now got 2 or 3 people who we're thinking about editing them. It's not going to be me, by the way. Yes.
Just a comment. I mean, there were other writers during the period developed during the war.
Darrell, for example.
I can't remember his name, but who lived in Yugoslavia, assisted Tito.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yes,
absolutely. Fitzroy MacLean.
Right.
Yeah.
We have Winds of War, the lady who wrote the Winds. I can't remember the title. A trilogy. The whole story begins in Romania, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yes, Olivia Manning.
Right.
So you see all these, I mean, you know, there's lots of writers, they're all celebrated in one way or another.
Literary traditions and the war opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think all that stuff comes into it. And of course, the Balkan trilogy and the Levant trilogy were also made into what I think was actually a very, very good TV series with Kenneth Branagh and what's her name? Emma Thompson. That's it. Yeah. But I think, well, you know, she's just had a big biography done of her, Olivia Manning, a recent one by somebody called Deirdre David. I think we do love all this period. Yes.
Was Fermor a person of religious faith?
I think he would love to have been. If you read his book called A Time to Keep Silence, which is about the monasteries, but the most important essay is the first one, which is about Saint-Vendry in Normandy. And he has, I think it's a wonderful, he understands so well what the monks are about. And it starts off, he goes there, he's only trying to find somewhere cheap where he can write. And he can't write in Paris because, you know, he goes out and gets drunk every night and then no work gets done the following day, etc. So he goes to this monastery where all he has to do is write. And at first he thinks, my God, you know, what am I doing here? It's like being in a tomb, you know, and all these men, they're not men, they're ghosts. And then gradually it's sort of the peace and the quiet and the significance of this place begin to sort of work their magic. And it's the most beautiful passage. And I think there he does describe a lot. He understands very well what the religious life means, what these monks have given up, the sacrifice that they've made. And also the fact that they are still, as you have as many temptations as the rest of us do. And at the same time, sometimes I sort of wonder that, you know, he's like a child looking through the bakery shop window, kind of wanting something that he just can't get to. He's just apart from it. And then I think, and certainly during the war, on his forms, he put down Roman Catholic. He was never a Roman Catholic. He was C of E. But he loved the idea of somehow being a part of this great liturgy, this great history, all this beauty and everything like that. But after the war, all that sort of dropped away, and Joan was definitely, she was very intellectual, very rigorous, and very atheistic, and so I think she probably knocked all that stuffing out of him. Yes, lady there. Yes, the lady.
Did he know you'd be writing a biography about him, and did he tell you as much as possible before he died in 2009?
He did know, yes. He had his arm twisted. His wife and his agent and his publishers were all saying, look, Paddy, you really got to appoint somebody and start working with them, because otherwise you can wake up, a month from now and somebody will have done it, unauthorized. So it was quite important, to get that done. So originally it was going to be done by my husband, Anthony Beevor, who'd written the thing of the battle and the resistance in Crete. And Anthony, having finished that book, wrote to Paddy and said, can I write your biography? And there was a terrible silence. So quite obviously Paddy wasn't ready. And then some years down the line, Anthony sat next to Joan, his wife, at a party, and she said, oh, when are you going to start Pad's biography then? So, and I said, I didn't even know I got the job, And so he said, well, I can't do it, but what about Artemis doing it? And so that's how it sort of came up, and I eventually did it. I think actually Paddy was happier for a woman to do it. And he actually sort of forgot that I was doing it. And sometimes he'd start talking about a story, and I'd say, oh, yeah, that's the time when you did. And he'd say, how do you know that? And I'd say, I'm writing your biography, Paddy. Ah, yes, so you are. And it was never very welcome news. And then he'd forget about it, and we'd carry on. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very beautiful presentation.
Well, thank you.
How would you compare his experiences, his narrative, his writings about Greece with his experiences, narratives, writings about other European countries, and not only European?
I think Greece, it's definitely, that's the place where he feels best, where he feels most at home. The other places he's visiting. And with Greece, I don't know, there's, to me anyway, those 2 books on Greece. Remember, there's 3 books on the Great Walk that he did. There's one on his first book, which was called The Traveller's Tree, which is about a journey in the Antilles. He's not, you don't feel there that although he's fascinated by all kinds of different things and full of stories, and it never really kind of engages him in the same way that Greece and the Greeks do. You have a feeling he's just travelling through. But in Greece, it's personal. Yes, the lady.
Could you say a word about his politics?
Yeah, they didn't exist, in a word. And people say, how can you live in Greece and not be politically, engagé in some form or other? It's in the air. But Paddy didn't really like politics. He liked politics when it became history. But otherwise, he was conservative, royalist, and really not engagé, except in the sort of major way is sort of war, when he was very vehemently anti-Nazi. But I think that was probably, and at the time of Cyprus, that was another time. But otherwise, I think he wasn't really interested. Yes?
Artemis is a proper Greek name.
It is.
So how did you come about with it?
I'll tell you exactly. My grandmother was called Diana. And so I was called after my grandmother and given the Greek. And I've been profoundly grateful. It's been a wonderful name to have. It was awful when I was at school, artichoke, art attack.
What was in his background that went into Greece? Was there anything in his background as he was growing up?
You see, the funny thing is that his mother was part of the sort of Anglo-Indian, they had slate mines, her family did. And his father was a grammar school scholarship. Nobody worked harder. Nobody was such a professional as his father. And his father was brought up in Camberwell and was literally a scholarship boy all the way through Wilson's Grammar School, Royal School of Mines. He becomes a geologist. He goes to India. And the whole of his working life is in India. And Paddy's mother, it was a disastrous marriage, really was. As Paddy said, what were they doing in each other's company? They should never have been allowed near each other. Anyway, But his mother was this sort of wonderful, kind of romantic, rather flighty person. And that marriage starts to go sour very, very quickly. And Paddy's born during the war, and his mother she does actually go back to India at that point, but when she comes back to put him through schooling and everything, she comes back with both children, because he has a sister, Vanessa. And so he's absolutely brought up in England. Now, the funny thing is that his sister often goes and eventually was sort of keeping house for her father in India. But Paddy never did, and I think his mother was very, very possessive, and he was her boy. And in a funny way, Vanessa was, you know, her father's daughter, but he was very much, I think, and it was sad, really, because he never really got to know his father, but they didn't get on terribly.
Amazes longevity, considering smoking.
Yeah, but the smoking stopped in
the poster for the Marlboro Man.
Sorry? It was what?
The poster of the Marlboro Man, you know.
Oh, the poster of the Marlboro Man. Yes, exactly. No, of course he didn't. He got cancer of the throat in 75, and it came back, and that's what killed him, mind you, at 96. But it was a pretty good innings, wasn't it?
But I don't want to end on that unhappy note, but speaking of minor vices, where we actually have two items that I want to bring to your attention before I speak. The reason one, we have the book from the Yale bookstore, they're selling it. So that's one thing, if you're interested in this story, do buy the book. Another is we have a wine tasting session by
now you're talking.
Reporter, so we can combine the conversation with some wine. But before we do, let's thank our speaker for this.